Welcome to In Your Neighborhood. I'm your host, Chris O'Rourke, and behind me is the Sunbury Christian Academy in Point Township, where in a moment we're going to show you a cool interactive lesson for some of their students. But first, we're going to head south to Snyder County to introduce you to a local man who's been running marathons for decades.
Not too many people have a life-size cutout of themselves running hanging on a wall in their home. Just like not too many people have 177 medals hanging on steel hangers on nearby walls either. But then, not too many people are Mark Sullivan. The Freeburg resident has been running marathons for decades, and along with his very impressive overall total are some of the streaks that he has: 32 straight Boston marathons, 25 straight Philadelphia marathons. Add to that the fact that he's a running coach and also does a lot of graphic design for races, and you have a life that has been built around a lifestyle change made a long time ago.
I took up running because I was sitting at a desk all day and I needed to get outside and do something. And I had been an avid backpacker, outdoorsman, that kind of thing. I used to do a lot of hiking and backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing, kayaking, whatever. And I couldn't get out every weekend to do that. And so I needed to do something regularly. I was sitting at a desk all the time and I thought, it's time for me to start doing something. So running seemed like a logical choice. It was easy, it was inexpensive, it was convenient. I could just go out the door and start. I didn't have to drive somewhere to do it, didn't have to pay greens fees, didn't have to pay court time, whatever. I was able to just go ahead and start doing it. So that's pretty much why I took it up.
Sullivan dove right in, running 3 miles a day for a long time before bumping it up to 6, and like most runners, he then decided to run a race. In this case, it was an 8K race in Selinsgrove. For those of you wondering, that's just under 5 miles, and a very unconventional race distance by today's standards. Your weekend warriors will tackle a 5K. If they want to move up from there, they may be able to find a 10K, but most will gravitate toward the very popular half marathon. From there, it's just a little bit more than a hop, skip, and a jump to a marathon, which is where Mark eventually headed. It was in 1986 that he traveled south to the Harrisburg Marathon, admitting to us that while he didn't train properly for it, he also didn't have the nightmare experience most runners have with their first marathon. Most importantly, Mark qualified for the Boston Marathon, but didn't think much of it at the time.
So the following year I was going to run another marathon, and that was the Jim Thorpe Marathon down in Carlisle. It got canceled about this time of year. So I said to my mom, I guess I'm not going to get to run a marathon after all. She said, why don't you go run Boston? You already qualified. And I said, well, I hadn't really thought about it and it's kind of late. I don't know if I can get in. And it was around, I think it was March that I was talking about this. The marathon always is the third Monday in April. So things were different back then. And of course now the marathon is sold out many, many months in advance. Usually the September, the year before, the marathon is closed. And this time there was still openings. Back then the marathon had like 9,000 people in it. And to put that in perspective, it was 9,000 people. It was considered a very, very large race at that time. And now Boston has 3 waves going off, and each one will have 9,000 people in it. So it gives you an idea of how big the race is comparatively. But as at the time, she said, well, you should see what you can do. So I made a couple of phone calls, and you had to join the Athletic Congress back then. They had to have a TAC number, they called it. So I went through the process, called this fellow who was in charge, and he said, yeah, we can get you in, get the number, et cetera, et cetera. And I called the Boston Athletic Association. They said, yeah, we still have openings. If you've qualified, you can get in. So I did that. The following year, I went to Boston, and I didn't really have that great of an experience. It was just a little overwhelming for me. It was such a new thing, and I was a new runner, and I was used to smaller races, smaller fields, and this was just such a big race.
Next year, the same thing. Sullivan had qualified for Boston again, but hadn't really given a second attempt much thought until people started asking him about it. He decided that with all he had learned the first year, a second attempt would go much smoother. That had him then thinking he could keep doing it, which he has 32 times. In doing so, he became a member of the Quarter Century Club, which is open to people who have run 25 or more consecutive Boston marathons. The catch is that you have to remain current to be in the club. In other words, you can't miss a year. Sullivan has the medals to prove it. They're the first ones you encounter when you walk into his home office, including the tragic year of 2013. He also has a closet just off the office that has 32 Boston Marathon coats of every type and color. He plans to keep going to Boston as long as he can, but on this day was nursing a non-running related injury, with Boston a little more than a month away. Sullivan always planned on running a marathon right from the start. The challenge was there, along with the interest in running 26.2 miles. As he began to build up the miles, Mark decided that the one thing he'll always like about running marathons is the long time period for preparation.
The fact that you had to prepare for months, there was weeks and weeks of training, building up your long runs, and I liked that. And in fact, in some ways, there were times when I was enjoying the training more than I was actually enjoying the event itself. There's something very, very enjoyable about some of those long weekend runs. You go out on a crisp fall morning and do a nice long run, and you're out there for a couple of hours, and it just gave you time to reflect. And it was an enjoyable time. I just enjoyed that part of it. And also, going to those events, you got to meet a lot of people. It was nice. I formed a lot of friendships, lasting friendships, and met a lot of people that I really liked and enjoyed being with. So that was a lure there too for it.
Mark says he wasn't into streaking at the start, which is running a race year after year after year, but his numbers at Boston and in races in general began to grow over the years. It wasn't until he started to get into the 70s and 80s totals and running between 6 and 9 marathons a year that he began to consider the fact that he would soon hit 100.
So I was looking ahead, trying to figure out when I would run it. And interestingly enough, the date that I had run my first marathon was the exact date that I had run my 50th marathon. And they both happened to be Harrisburg. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I should look at the date and see what's going to happen when I get to that point. And it turned out to be the exact same date for my 100th marathon. So I was going to be running the exact same day at the exact same race for 150 and 100. So I thought that would be a good thing to do. I'll shoot for that for my 100th. So that year, when I had my schedule figured out, I was going through the process of running these races. One of the races I was going to run was the B&A Trail Marathon, which was down in Annapolis, Baltimore-Annapolis area. And they got hit with this massive snowstorm, and that usually was run in March, that race. And they got hit with a massive snowstorm in early March, and they had 36 inches of snow on the course, and they said, we can't run the race, it's canceled. And I was just trying to figure out where I'm going to squeeze another race in here, because I had them pretty much stacked up, and I knew I was going to run the Marine Corps Marathon just before I ran Harrisburg, and I had all these worked out. So I was in Canada to run the Rock and Roll Canada Marathon, and I had run that every year they had it. And there was a man there that I met named John Stanton. John Stanton owns the Running Room, which is a chain of running stores across Canada. He had invited me out to come out to Edmonton, and they had a race in Edmonton that year. And he said, listen, he said, I heard you speak at the pasta party. I'd like you to come out to Edmonton. He said, you come out there, I'll put you up, and you run our race. And he said, and you can speak at the pasta party. And he said, that'll be your extra marathon, and you'll get one in there. I said, oh, that's a pretty good proposition. So I thought about it, and his race was in June. In fact, it was run on the longest day of the year, and it's in Edmonton, Alberta. So you're very high up, and the sun doesn't set till like about 11 o'clock at night, 11:30 at night out there. So the race was called the Race to Twilight Marathon. And so I did that and ran that race, and then came back, and I had others lined up, and that year, when Harrisburg rolled around, was my 100th. And so I got that in there, and actually haven't been back to Harrisburg